The words hung in the air like a physical force, reverberating off the obsidian walls of the fortress courtyard. Alara's legs, which had somehow carried her across miles of cursed wasteland, finally gave out. She crumpled to the black stone, her palms scraping against the unnaturally smooth surface that seemed to pulse with its own dark heartbeat. Through the haze of exhaustion and the poison's relentless assault on her mind, she tried to process what she'd just heard. She stays with me. The Alpha King's declaration made no sense. She was a ghost from the mortal realm, a disgraced physician who should mean nothing to the most powerful shapeshifter in Valdris. Yet his golden eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "My king," a gravelly voice spoke from somewhere to her left. Alara forced her head up to see a man built like a mountain, his scarred face twisted with concern. "You don't know what she is, what she might carry. The mortal realm's conflicts." "Commander Thane," Darian's voice cut through the protest like a blade through silk. "When did I begin requiring permission to make decisions in my own territory?" The massive commander's jaw tightened, but he stepped back with a grudging bow. "Of course, my king. I merely suggest caution with refugees." Refugee. The word stung more than Alara expected. 3 months ago, she'd been Dr. Alara Voss, the youngest physician ever appointed to the Royal Circle, her hands steady enough to suture a hummingbird's wing, her knowledge vast enough to cure ailments that had stumped healers for centuries. Now she was exactly what the commander said, a refugee in torn rags, fleeing a kingdom that wanted her dead. The memories wavered at the edges, fragments of that terrible night when it burst into the council chambers with evidence of the silver poisoning, the shock on the advisors' faces, the king's confusion as she'd explained how they were slowly killing him. And then, darkness, the searing pain of the dart in her neck, the cursed toxin flooding her system as hands dragged her toward the dungeons. "Can you stand?" Darian's voice was closer now, though she hadn't seen him move. When she looked up, he was crouched before her, and this close, the sheer presence of him was overwhelming. Magic radiated from his skin like heat from a forge, not the refined, delicate power of court mages, but something primal and ancient that spoke directly to her bones. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. When had she last spoken to another living soul? The journey through the Shadowlands had been a blur of stumbling through landscapes that shifted like living nightmares, avoiding the twisted creatures that hunted in the eternal twilight. "I can try." His hand extended toward her, and she stared at it for a moment that stretched too long. Those fingers could shift into claws capable of tearing through steel. That palm could transform into a paw the size of a dinner plate. The stories about his wolf form weren't just legendary, they were terrifying. Yet now he offered assistance with the patience of someone waiting for a wounded bird to trust. She placed her trembling hand in his, and the contact sent a shock through her system that had nothing to do with the poison. His skin was warm, almost fevered, and calloused in a way that spoke of a ruler who didn't shy away from physical combat. When he helped her to her feet, she swayed, and his other hand moved to steady her elbow. "When did you last eat?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that made her think he already knew the answer. "I don't." The poison made it hard to hold on to linear time. Days blended into one endless twilight march. There was a stream. Yesterday? Or... She closed her eyes, trying to focus through the fog in her mind. "I found some berries, but they might have been poisonous. Everything here seems poisonous." A sound that might have been dark amusement escaped him. The Shadowlands aren't kind to visitors from the mortal realm. Most don't survive the first night. She met his gaze then, seeing her own reflection in those golden depths, hollow-cheeked, wild-haired, more ghost than woman. "Maybe I didn't survive. Maybe this is just what comes after." "You're very much alive, Dr. Voss." Her surname on his lips made her stomach drop. Of course he knew who she was. The Alpha King's network of information probably rivaled her former kingdom's spy system, which meant he knew exactly what she'd been accused of, why she'd been exiled, why bounty hunters from 3 realms would pay handsomely for proof of her death. "Then you know what I am," she whispered. "What they say I did." His hand was still on her elbow, steady and warm, anchoring her to this moment when everything else felt like it might dissolve. I know many things, Ilara Voss, but what I know and what others believe rarely align. The way he said her name, not doctor, not the traitor, not the exile, just her name, sent something unfamiliar spiraling through her chest. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why protect someone who brings nothing but trouble? His smile was sharp as winter moonlight. Who said you bring nothing? Before she could ask what he meant by that cryptic response, the Alpha King's attention shifted to the gathered crowd of his people. With a gesture so subtle she almost missed it, he dismissed them all. The courtyard emptied with efficient silence, though Ilara caught the worried glances thrown in her direction. To them, she was exactly what Commander Thane had named her, an unknown quantity, a potential threat carried in on the cursed winds of the Shadowlands. Come, Darian said, his hand still steadying her. You need food, rest, and proper healing before we discuss anything else. The next hours passed in a haze that felt more surreal than her journey through the wasteland. She was escorted, though it felt more like being gently herded, through corridors of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Servants appeared and disappeared like shadows, bringing steaming bowls of broth that actually stayed down, warm clothes that fit well enough to be decent, and a bath that nearly made her weep with gratitude. For the first time in months, Ilara allowed herself to think beyond simple survival. As she sank into water hot enough to ease the constant ache in her bones, she tried to reconcile this reality with everything she'd known about the Shadowlands. This wasn't the realm of monsters and madness described in Mortal Kingdom texts. The fortress ran with the precision of a well-organized hospital, servants moving with purpose, guards changing shifts with military efficiency. It reminded her painfully of what she'd lost. Her quarters in the Royal Circle had been a sanctuary of organized chaos. Medical texts stacked on every surface, herb gardens crowding the windows, patient files arranged in systems only she understood. She'd lived and breathed healing, often forgetting to eat until her assistant Marcus would arrive with dinner and pointed reminders about physician wellness. Her days had followed rhythms as reliable as sunrise, morning rounds with the most critical patients, afternoon consultations with the other circle physicians, evenings spent in research or treating the palace staff who preferred her gentle bedside manner to the stern efficiency of the senior healers. She'd had respect, purpose, a place in the world where her skills mattered, where she could see the direct impact of her work in every life, saved, every fever broken, every wound properly mended. The memory of her last normal day struck her with unexpected force. King Edmund's routine examination, during which she'd noticed the subtle tremor in his left hand, the faint discoloration under his nails that spoke of heavy metal toxicity. She'd spent 3 days researching, cross-referencing symptoms, testing samples in secret before she'd been certain enough to act. Even now, knowing how it had all ended, she couldn't regret trying to save him. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Dr. Voss?" The voice was female, respectful. "His Majesty has requested your presence in his study when you're ready." His Majesty. The formal address sent an odd flutter through her chest. In her former life, she'd been accustomed to royal protocols, but this felt different, more personal despite the ceremony. When she emerged from her chambers, and wasn't that surreal having chambers again, a young woman with the distinctive, golden eyes of the wolf-born waited to escort her. "I'm Sarah," she said with a shy smile. "I assist with the healing halls here." "His Majesty mentioned you were a physician?" The question carried hope, and Ilara felt something long dormant stir in her chest. "I was. She paused, unsure how much of her story had already spread through the fortress. "It's been some time since I practiced." "We could use the help," Sarah admitted as they walked. "Master Aldrich is skilled, but he's getting older, and some of the pack injuries." She gestured vaguely. "Shapeshifter healing is complicated. We've heard mortals sometimes have different approaches that work better." Different approaches. Ilara's mind immediately began cataloging the theoretical challenges of treating shapeshifter physiology, the accelerated healing that could sometimes work against itself, the magical metabolism that might affect how medications were processed, the complex interplay between human and animal forms during recovery. For the first time since her exile, she felt that familiar spark of intellectual curiosity, the healer's instinct to understand and solve. They stopped before a set of carved doors that seemed to pulse with the same dark energy as the walls. Sarah knocked once, then stepped back with a respectful bow as one door opened on its own. "Thank you, Sarah," came Darian's voice from within. "Dr. Voss, please, join me." Ilara stepped into what could only be described as a scholar's paradise. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, not just the standard histories and military treatises she'd expected, but medical texts, magical theory, philosophical works in languages she recognized and some she didn't. Maps covered one entire wall, showing not just the Shadowlands but realms she'd only heard whispered about in the most academic circles. This wasn't the study of a simple warrior king. This belonged to someone who understood that true power required knowledge. And somehow, impossibly, she was here. Darian stood with his back to her, studying the wall of maps, but she could feel his awareness of her presence like a physical weight. In the soft lamplight of the study, he seemed less the intimidating Alpha King and more human, though she knew that assessment was dangerously naive. "The medical texts," she found herself saying, her eyes drawn to a particular shelf. "Some of these are from the Celestial Archives. They haven't been in circulation for centuries." He turned then, and his golden eyes held something that might have been satisfaction. Knowledge shouldn't be hoarded by those too afraid to use it, especially knowledge that could save lives. The pointed nature of his comment wasn't lost on her. How much did he know about why she'd been exiled? "Saving lives isn't always appreciated by those in power," she said carefully. "No," he agreed, moving to pour 2 glasses of wine from a crystal decanter. "It isn't, but that doesn't make it less necessary." He offered her a glass, and she hesitated. Wine meant relaxation, conversation, a level of trust she wasn't sure she was ready for. But the alternative was the constant tension that had kept her alive through the wasteland, and she was so tired of being afraid. The wine was unlike anything from her former kingdom, darker, with an earthiness that spoke of soil and growing things. It warmed her from the inside out, easing muscles she hadn't realized were still clenched. "Sarah mentioned that your healers could use assistance," Ilara said, then immediately wished she could take it back. She had no right to offer services, no idea what game she'd stumbled into by being here. "They could," Darian confirmed, settling into a chair across from her. "But that's not why I've asked you here." A chill ran down her spine despite the wine's warmth. "Then why?" Instead of answering immediately, he reached for something on the side table, a leather portfolio she hadn't noticed before. When he opened it, her breath caught. Letters, dozens of them, in handwriting she recognized. "These arrived 3 days ago," Darian said quietly, "from various sources across the mortal realm, all saying the same thing, that Dr. Ilara Voss was dead, killed while fleeing justice for attempted regicide." Her hand trembled as she set down the wine glass. "Attempted? They're saying I tried to kill King Edmund? According to these reports, you poisoned his wine during a private dinner. He barely survived." His voice was carefully neutral, but those golden eyes never left her face. "The official story is that you confessed before taking your own life rather than face execution." The study seemed to tilt around her. "That's not. I was trying to save him. The silver poisoning was killing him slowly. I had proof, documentation of the symptoms, the progression." The words tumbled out in a rush as the memory sharpened with desperate clarity. Someone was dosing his food with silver powder. Tiny amounts, enough to build up over time. "I traced it back to the kitchen staff, found the supplier." "And when you brought this evidence to the king?" He was grateful, concerned. "He ordered an investigation." She pressed her palms against her temples, fighting through the poison's fog. "But then, that night, soldiers came. They said I was under arrest for treason. There was no trial, no chance to defend myself. Just the dart, the poison, and then I was being dragged toward the dungeons. Darian leaned forward, his attention focused on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The poison they used on you. Describe the symptoms. It was such a clinical request that she found herself responding automatically. Memory fragmentation, muscle weakness, periodic disorientation. But it's not designed to kill quickly. More like torture, to break someone down slowly. Show me your hands. The request was so unexpected that she complied without thinking, extending her palms toward him. He didn't touch her, but his eyes cataloged every detail. The faint blue tinge under her nails, the tremor in her fingers. Shadowbane extract, he said grimly, combined with something else, something I don't recognize. He met her gaze. This isn't a mortal realm poison, Alara. Someone with access to very specific magical resources wanted you broken, not dead. The implications hit her like a physical blow. You're saying someone planned this, not just my exile, but all of it. I'm saying that someone went to extraordinary lengths to remove you from your position and make sure you couldn't return to it. He stood, moving to the map wall, his finger tracing the borders between realms. The question is why? What makes one disgraced court physician worth such elaborate machinations? She stared at him, her mind reeling. This wasn't sanctuary he was offering. It was recruitment. He didn't just want to protect her, he wanted to use her. But for what? I don't know, she whispered. His smile was sharp as a blade. Then it appears we have a mystery to solve. The question is, are you brave enough to uncover the truth, even if it destroys everything you thought you knew about your own life? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Alara felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the Shadowland's eternal chill. Brave enough. The words echoed in her mind as she stared at Darian's expectant face, those golden eyes reflecting a confidence she didn't feel. She started to speak, then stopped, her throat closing around words that wouldn't come. The wine glass trembled in her hands, and she set it down before it could shatter. You don't understand what you're asking, don't I? He moved closer, not threatening but intent, like a predator who'd caught an interesting scent. You're a healer, Alara. Your entire life has been built on uncovering truth, diagnosing what others miss, finding the source of disease, cutting away infection to save the whole. How is this different? Because this could get us both killed. The words burst out of her with more force than she'd intended, and she immediately looked toward the door, half expecting guards to come running. But the study remained silent, except for the soft crackle of the fireplace. Darian's expression didn't change. Death is always a possibility. The question is whether the alternative is worse. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the fortress's courtyard. Below, shapeshifters went about their evening routines, guards changing shifts, servants carrying supplies, children playing games that involved far too much teeth and claws for comfort. A functioning society, a place where Darian's people were safe. You have everything here, she said quietly. A kingdom, loyal subjects, power that spans realms. Why risk it for someone who brings nothing but trouble? You keep saying that you bring nothing. His voice was closer now, and when she turned, he was standing just behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. But you saved a king's life. You uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. You survived 3 months in the Shadowlands, alone, poisoned, with nothing but your will to live. Tell me again how that's nothing. The praise felt like acid in her chest. I failed. King Edmund might be dead because I couldn't make them listen fast enough. My assistant Marcus, her voice broke on his name, sweet, loyal Marcus, who'd brought her dinner and reminded her to sleep and probably tried to defend her when the soldiers came. I don't even know what happened to him, to anyone who was associated with me. So you'll honor their sacrifice by hiding in the shadows for the rest of your life? The harsh words made her flinch. It's not that simple. Isn't it? Darian moved to stand beside her at the window, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. Someone orchestrated your downfall with precision that speaks of months of planning. They used a poison that required access to both mortal and magical resources. They spread a false story of your death across multiple realms within days of your exile. This isn't the work of a jealous rival or a disgruntled noble. This is something much larger. Alara's hands clenched into fists as the implications crashed over her again. The scope of it was terrifying. The resources, the coordination, the sheer malevolent intelligence required to destroy her life so completely. "What if we uncover the truth, and it's worse than we imagined?" she whispered. "What if this conspiracy reaches into your kingdom too? What if by helping me, you're painting a target on everyone under your protection?" For a long moment, Darian was quiet. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that reminded her exactly who she was talking to. 3 years ago, a plague swept through the eastern settlements, magical in nature, resistant to every healing method my physicians knew. It killed 47 of my people before we found a cure. She turned to look at him, seeing something raw in his expression. "The plague wasn't natural," he continued. "It was created in a laboratory, deployed deliberately, designed to test our defenses. We never found who was responsible, but the attack patterns, the timing." He met her gaze. "Someone is already moving against the Shadowlands, Alara. The question isn't whether I'm painting a target on my kingdom. The question is whether I'm going to let them continue picking us off piece by piece, or if I'm going to fight back." The pieces clicked together in her mind with horrible clarity. "You think whoever destroyed my life is connected to your plague? I think that anyone capable of the kind of coordinated magical and political manipulation that brought you here is exactly the kind of enemy who would test biological weapons on shapeshifter populations." His smile was sharp as a blade's edge. "And I think that between your medical expertise and my resources, we might actually be able to stop them." Alara stared at him, her mind racing. Everything logical, everything safe, screamed at her to refuse. To accept the sanctuary he'd offered and spend the rest of her life quietly tending wounds and staying invisible. But 47 people were dead. Marcus might be dead. And somewhere out there, whoever had destroyed her life was still moving pieces on a board she was only beginning to see. "I need time to think," she whispered. His nod was understanding, but his eyes held no mercy. "Of course. But Alara?" He moved toward the door, then paused. "Time is the one thing we may not have much of." After Darian left, Alara stood frozen at the window until the courtyard below emptied of all but the night guards. The silence pressed against her like a living thing, heavy with implications and unspoken promises. She tried to return to her chambers, to lose herself in sleep or at least the pretense of rest, but her feet carried her deeper into the fortress instead. The corridors seemed to shift around her in the lamplight, shadows dancing across stone that hummed with ancient power. She found herself in what could only be the healing halls. The scent of herbs and healing salves was unmistakable, comforting in its familiarity. Through an open doorway, she glimpsed rows of beds, most empty, a few occupied by patients whose injuries spoke of the dangerous world beyond these walls. "Dr. Voss?" Sarah appeared from a supply room, her arms full of fresh linens. "Is everything all right?" No. Nothing was all right. Nothing had been all right since the moment she'd discovered silver poisoning in a king's blood and decided to act on it. But looking at Sarah's concerned face, at the healing hall that so desperately needed experienced hands, Alara felt something shift inside her chest. "The patient in the third bed," she heard herself saying. "The shoulder wound, it's not healing properly." Sarah's eyes widened. "How did you... from here?" The smell. Infection has a distinctive scent when it's fighting shapeshifter healing. Alara moved before she could stop herself, approaching the bed where a young man lay restless with fever. "May I?" The patient's eyes opened as she drew near, golden like all the wolfborn, but clouded with pain. "You're the mortal woman," he said weakly, "the one the Alpha King brought back, as if she'd belonged here all along." Her hands moved without conscious thought, checking his pulse, the heat of his skin, the way he favored the injured shoulder. The wound itself was clean, well stitched, but something was wrong beneath the surface. "When did this happen?" "5 days ago," Sarah supplied. "Border patrol." He took a blade meant for his partner. And it's been cleaned how many times? Twice daily with silver-blessed water to prevent infection. Ilara's hands stilled. Silver-blessed water. On a shapeshifter. She saw the moment Sarah understood, horror dawning in those golden eyes. We're poisoning him. The silver, it would kill bacteria in mortal wounds, but in shapeshifters, it interferes with natural healing, probably why the infection is so resistant. Ilara turned to fully face Sarah, and in that moment, the last of her resistance crumbled. She couldn't stand here, in a place of healing, and watch someone suffer from ignorance she could remedy. Do you have pure water? No silver blessing, no magical enhancement, just clean water. The next hour passed in a blur of activity that felt like coming home. Cleaning the wound properly, identifying the specific bacterial strain, mixing a poultice from herbs that would work with shapeshifter physiology rather than against it. The young guard's fever broke just as the fortress bells chimed midnight, and he fell into the first peaceful sleep he'd had in days. How did you know? Sarah asked softly as they cleaned up. About the silver interaction? I didn't, but I know how to observe, how to test, how to think beyond the accepted methods. Ilara dried her hands, marveling at how natural it felt to be working again. Sometimes the cure we think we need is actually part of the problem. The words hung in the air with weight beyond their medical context. Dr. Voss? Sarah's voice was carefully neutral. Whatever His Majesty asked of you tonight, the kingdom needs healers like you. People who see what others miss. People who see what others miss. Like silver poisoning in a king's blood. Like patterns that shouldn't exist. Like the careful orchestration of her own destruction. Ilara looked around the healing hall one more time, seeing not just what was, but what could be. Better training for the staff, updated techniques that accounted for shapeshifter physiology, research into the magical plague that had killed 47 people. A life spent hiding would save no one. But a life spent fighting back. She found Darian in his study, still awake despite the late hour, poring over maps by lamplight. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression suggested he'd been expecting her. I'll do it, she said simply. Whatever this is, whatever it costs, I'll help you find the truth. His smile was fierce and proud, and for the first time since her exile began, Ilara felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Then we begin tomorrow, he said. And Ilara, there's no going back from this choice. She thought of Marcus, of 47 dead shapeshifters, of the patient sleeping peacefully because she'd chosen to act rather than hide. Good, she said. I'm tired of running. The dawn that broke over the Shadowlands was different from any Ilara had known. Not the gentle gold of her former kingdom, but a deep crimson that painted the obsidian towers in shades of dried blood. She stood at her chamber window, watching the fortress come alive below, and tried to reconcile the woman who had spoken so boldly last night with the one whose hands trembled around her morning tea. There's no going back from this choice. A sharp knock interrupted her brooding. Dr. Voss? Sarah's voice carried an urgency that made Ilara's pulse quicken. His Majesty requests your presence in the war room, immediately. The war room. Not the comfortable study where they'd made their pact, but somewhere that spoke of serious business. Ilara dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar fastenings of Shadowlands clothing. Darker than she was used to, cut for movement, with subtle protective enchantments woven into the fabric. The war room occupied the fortress's central tower, its walls lined with maps that seemed to shift and update themselves as she watched. Darian stood at the head of a massive stone table, surrounded by figures who radiated the same predatory confidence she'd come to associate with his inner circle. When she entered, all conversation ceased. Gentlemen, Darian said without looking up from the map spread before him, meet Dr. Ilara Voss, our new ally in understanding exactly who has been targeting both mortal and shapeshifter populations. A woman with silver-streaked hair and scars across her knuckles stepped forward. Commander Thorne, head of intelligence. Her golden eyes assessed Ilara with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to evaluating threats. Your Majesty, with respect, involving an outsider in strategic discussions, is exactly what we need. Darian interrupted smoothly. Dr. Voss brings perspective we lack. She's seen the enemy's work from the mortal side. He gestured to the map, where red markers indicated points across multiple realms. Show her. Commander Thorne's expression remained skeptical, but she obeyed. 17 incidents over the past 2 years. Assassinations, mysterious illnesses, political upheavals, all involving individuals who posed threats to something. We haven't been able to determine the common thread. Alara approached the table, her medical training automatically cataloging patterns. May I? At Darian's nod, she leaned closer, studying the markers. These deaths, do you have details on the methods? A younger man with ink-stained fingers pushed forward a leather portfolio. Scribe Matthias, I've compiled everything we know. His voice held the reverence of someone who understood the power of information. Poison features in 40% of cases, always different compounds, always untraceable. As Alara read, a chill settled in her bones. The patterns weren't random, they were surgical. Each death or disgrace had been precisely calculated to remove specific obstacles. A healer who had discovered contamination in grain supplies, a scholar researching ancient magical bloodlines, a military commander who had been investigating unusual troop movements. They're clearing the board, she whispered, removing anyone who might interfere with— What? That, said a new voice from the doorway, is what we're going to find out. The man who entered moved with fluid grace that spoke of barely contained power. His eyes were the deep green of forest shadows, and when he smiled at Alara, she felt the unsettling sensation of being evaluated by something that wasn't entirely human. Lord Kieran Ashwood, Darian said by way of introduction. My spy master. And the reason we know as much as we do. Kieran's bow was perfectly executed and somehow mocking. Dr. Voss, I've been looking forward to meeting the woman who has caused such interesting ripples across the political landscape. He moved to the map, placing one pale finger on a marker near the mortal realm's capital. Your little discovery about King Edmund's poisoning, it accelerated something. Our enemies have been scrambling to adjust their timeline. How do you know that? Alara demanded. His smile was sharp as winter ice. Because 3 of their agents have died in the past week, all from the same untraceable poison that's been coursing through your veins. Someone is cleaning house, eliminating loose ends. The implications hit her like a physical blow. They're killing their own people. Which means, Commander Thorne said grimly, whatever they're planning is about to happen. Soon enough that they're willing to sacrifice experienced operatives to maintain secrecy. Darian's hands pressed flat against the table, his knuckles white with tension. Kieran's network has identified 3 possible targets for the next phase. A research facility in the Northlands studying ancient bloodline magic, the trade summit between the 5 realms scheduled for next month, or his golden eyes met hers. The conclave of healers set to begin in 7 days. The room went silent except for the whisper of wind through arrow slits. Alara's mind raced, connecting threads she'd been too poisoned and traumatized to see before. The questions King Edmund had asked about her family history. The unusual interest certain nobles had shown in her research. The way her assistant Marcus had been specifically targeted for recruitment to her staff. They wanted me there, she breathed. At the conclave. That's why they didn't just kill me. They needed me discredited, exiled, but alive. In case their primary plan failed. Commander Thorne's expression shifted from skepticism to grim respect. What kind of plan would require a healer of your caliber? Alara looked around the room at these predators who had somehow become her allies and felt the last of her illusions crumble, the kind that involves making a lot of people very sick. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Alara watched as the implications crystallized across the faces surrounding her. Commander Thorne's scarred knuckles went white as she gripped the table edge. Scribe Matthias dropped his quill, ink spattering across his careful notes. Even Lord Kieran's perpetual smile faltered into something cold and calculating. Elaborate, Darian commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha who sensed a threat to his pack. Alara's mind raced through the possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. The conclave brings together the most skilled healers from all 5 realms. We share knowledge, debate techniques, demonstrate new treatments. But more importantly, she paused, the full scope of the conspiracy becoming clear. We also prepare for mass casualty events, plague responses, battlefield medicine, coordinated care across multiple kingdoms. A perfect testing ground, Kieran murmured, his green eyes sharp with understanding. Not just for deploying a biological weapon, but for ensuring the response would fail. Worse than that. Alara moved to the map, her finger tracing the locations where the conclave would establish temporary treatment centers. If you could corrupt the healing protocols from the source, introduce treatments that seemed helpful but actually accelerated whatever pathogen you deployed, you could turn the entire medical response into a weapon. Commander Thorne's face had gone pale beneath her tan. How many healers attend this conclave? Nearly 200. From every major kingdom, including the Shadowlands. Alara's voice caught as the full horror struck her. They go home afterward, to royal courts, major cities, military outposts. If you could compromise them, make them unwitting carriers or saboteurs, you'd have a network of agents in place to cripple any organized response to further attacks, Darian finished grimly. And they'd never know they were being used. The silence that followed was broken only by the scratch of Matthias's quill as he frantically documented their revelations. Ilara found herself studying the faces around the table, these shapeshifters who had become her unlikely allies. The weight of what they were contemplating pressed down on her like a physical force. "We have to stop it," she said, though the words felt inadequate against the magnitude of the threat. "How?" Commander Thorne's question carried the bluntness of someone accustomed to dealing in harsh realities. "The conclave begins in 7 days. Even if we could warn the organizers, prove this conspiracy exists, they'd never cancel an event that's been planned for months. Too much political prestige is at stake." Lord Kieran pushed away from the table, beginning to pace with predatory restlessness. "My sources could eliminate key operatives, but without knowing the full scope of their network, you'd just force them to accelerate their timeline," Alara interrupted. "Make them more desperate, more willing to take risks that could kill innocents." She closed her eyes, forcing herself to think beyond the fear. "We need intelligence. We need to know exactly what they're planning, how they intend to deploy it, who's been compromised. Which means someone needs to go to the conclave," Darian said quietly. The room erupted in immediate protest. Commander Thorne's voice rose above the others. "Absolutely not. Dr. Voss is a known target. Sending her into the heart of enemy operations would be suicide. Not to mention strategically idiotic," Kieran added with unusual vehemence. "She's the only person who survived their poisoning protocol and retained enough memory to identify their methods. We can't risk losing that intelligence." But Alara was already shaking her head, certainty settling in her chest like armor. "I'm also the only person who knows the conclave's protocols well enough to identify where they've been compromised. The only healer who might recognize their biological weapons before deployment." She met Darian's gaze across the table. "And the only one who has a legitimate reason to be there, despite everything that's happened." "Your reputation was destroyed," Commander Thorne protested. "You're officially dead in most realms." "Officially, yes. But the healers who matter, the ones who've read my research, who know my work, they'll remember me." Ilara's voice grew stronger as the plan crystallized. A disgraced physician seeking redemption? Someone desperate enough to risk attending despite the bounty on her head? That's exactly the kind of person they'd want to recruit. Darian had gone very still. The way she'd learned meant he was thinking furiously. "You'd be walking into a trap." "I'd be walking into a trap, on her terms." Alara straightened, feeling the familiar clarity that came when a diagnosis finally clicked into place. With preparation, backup, and the element of surprise. "They think I'm a broken exile. They have no idea what I've learned here, what allies I've found." The silence stretched taut as bowstring between them. Finally, Lord Kieran spoke, his voice thoughtful. "It could work, if we can establish secure communication, position assets nearby." "No." The word cracked through the room like a whip. and Alara turned to find Darien watching her with something like anguish in his golden eyes. "I won't send you to face them alone." "Then don't send me alone," she replied simply. The war room fell silent except for the soft hiss of torchlight against stone. Alara watched emotions war across Darien's face, the Alpha King struggling against the man who had somehow begun to care for her beyond political necessity. "What are you suggesting?" Commander Thorne's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who already suspected the answer and didn't like it. "The Conclave has a security detail," Alara said, her mind racing through possibilities. "Guards, escorts for high-ranking healers. Shapeshifters are often hired for such roles. Your enhanced senses, your ability to detect threats humans might miss." She turned to Darien, her heart hammering against her ribs. No one would question the Alpha King sending representatives to protect his realm's interests. Lord Kieran's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You're suggesting His Majesty walk into the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by potentially compromised healers and unknown magical weapons, to play bodyguard to a woman they've already tried to kill twice." "I'm suggesting we stop reacting and start taking control of the situation," Alara shot back. "Every day we spend planning is another day they have to perfect their attack. How many will die while we debate the risks?" The maps on the walls seemed to pulse with malevolent life, red markers spreading like infection across the realms. Darien moved to stand before the largest map, his broad shoulders blocking out the light from the windows. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute decision. "If we do this, and I'm not saying we will, what would you need?" Alara's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to even consider it. Medical supplies, antidotes for common poisons, protective gear, detection equipment for biological agents. And, she hesitated, knowing this next request would test his trust in her. "Access to my old research notes, the ones they tried so hard to destroy. Those notes were confiscated when you were exiled," Commander Thorne said flatly. "Burned in the public square." The copies were burned. Alara met Darien's golden gaze steadily. "I kept the originals hidden, in a place they would never think to look." Kieran stepped forward, predatory interest sharpening his features. "Where?" "The royal crypts beneath my former kingdom's capital. In my family's burial vault." The words tasted like grave dirt and old sorrow. "My research into bloodline magic, ancient healing techniques, the interaction between shapeshifter and mortal physiology. Everything they wanted destroyed is there. Getting into those crypts would require a healer's staff with blood rights to the vault," Alara finished, "which I still carry, despite everything else they took from me." Darien turned from the map, and she saw something new in his expression. Respect mingled with a fierce protectiveness that made her pulse quicken. "The crypts are heavily warded against shapeshifters. I couldn't accompany you there. But Kieran could arrange for mortal agents to—" Commander Thorne began. "No." Alara shook her head. "The wards are blood-locked to my family line. Anyone else who tries to enter will trigger alarms that reach directly to the current king. Only I can retrieve those notes without alerting Edmund's remaining allies." The weight of what she was proposing settled over the room like a funeral shroud. To retrieve her research, she would have to return to the kingdom that had cast her out, walk among the crypts of her ancestors while knowing that above her, those who had orchestrated her downfall still held power. And then, with whatever intelligence she gathered, she would have to infiltrate the conclave where her enemies waited. "There's another problem," Scribe Matthias spoke up quietly from his corner. "The journey to the mortal capital and back, plus infiltrating the conclave. We're talking about at least 10 days. Your Majesty, you can't be absent from the Shadowlands that long without triggering succession concerns among the other packs." Darien's jaw tightened. "Then we make it look like I'm still here. Kieran, can your people maintain that illusion? For a few days, perhaps. But—" "Your Majesty." Commander Thorne's voice cut through the discussion like a blade. "You're talking about abandoning your kingdom, your responsibilities, your pack, to chase after a woman into what could very well be an elaborate trap designed specifically to eliminate you." The accusation hung in the air, and Alara felt the familiar weight of guilt settle on her shoulders. How many people had suffered because of their association with her? How many more would pay the price for this desperate gambit? But when she looked at the map, at those spreading red markers representing death and conspiracy, she knew they were past the point of safe choices. "Commander Thorne is right," she said quietly. "This is madness. I should go alone." "No." Darian's voice carried absolute finality. "If you go, I go. We face this together or not at all." Something shifted in the room then, a subtle change in the air that spoke of decisions made and bridges burned. They were committed now, for better or worse. The ordeal had begun. The first sign of trouble came 3 days into their journey, when Lord Kieran's communication crystal went dark. They had made good time across the borderlands, traveling in a small party that drew little attention. Darian in the guise of a mercenary captain, Elara disguised as a traveling scholar, with 2 of Kieran's most trusted agents playing their escorts. The plan had seemed solid: retrieve her research from the crypts, gather intelligence on the conspiracy's scope, then position themselves at the conclave to intercept whatever attack was coming. But as they crested the hill overlooking her former kingdom's capital, Elara felt the first cold finger of dread trace down her spine. The city sprawled below them, but something was wrong with the light. Where there should have been the warm glow of hearth fires and street lamps, an unnatural crimson aurora flickered across the sky like spilled blood. "That's not supposed to be there," she whispered, her medical training automatically cataloging the wrongness. The aurora pulsed with a rhythm too regular to be natural, like a massive heartbeat painting the heavens. Darian's hand found her shoulder, his touch warm against the sudden chill. "What does it mean?" Before she could answer, one of their escorts, a lean man named Vale, who had served Kieran for years, suddenly stiffened in his saddle. His eyes rolled back, showing only white, and when he spoke, his voice carried the flat tone of magical compulsion. "The physician returns to her grave. How thoughtful of her to bring the Wolf King as an offering." The words hit like a physical blow. Elara watched in horror as Vale's hand moved to the poisoned dagger at his belt, the same blade he'd been instructed to carry for their protection. But instead of drawing it in defense, he pressed it to his own throat. "Vale, no!" But Kieran's shout came too late. The compelled agent drew the blade across his neck in one swift motion, and as his blood hit the ground, the earth beneath their horses began to smoke. "Trap!" Darian snarled, his form already beginning to blur as his wolf fought to emerge. It was all a trap. The second escort was screaming now, her body convulsing as the same compulsion that had claimed Vale took hold. Elara lunged toward her, medical instincts overriding fear, but Darian caught her arm. "Don't touch her. The blood. It's a summoning circle." He was right. Vale's blood had spread in an impossible pattern, defying gravity and logic as it traced symbols across the rocky ground. Where it touched, reality seemed to fray at the edges, revealing glimpses of somewhere else, a place of shadow and whispers and things that should not be. And through those tears in the world, they came. The creatures that poured forth had once been human. Elara could see enough remaining features to recognize that much. But whatever process had transformed them had left them as mockeries of life, their skin hanging in gray tatters, their eyes burning with the same crimson light that stained the sky. "Revenants," Darian breathed, and she heard genuine fear in his voice for the first time since she'd known him. "They know we're here. They've been waiting." The largest of the creatures, something that might once have been a soldier, fixed its burning gaze on Elara. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of grave dirt falling on coffin lids. "The bloodline ends tonight. The last daughter of the Binding comes home to die." Binding. The word hit her like a lightning strike, unleashing a flood of memories she hadn't known she possessed. Images flashed through her mind, her grandmother teaching her to weave light into healing salves, her mother drawing protective wards with her own blood, ancient voices whispering of a compact made between her ancestors and something vast and hungry. "Elara." Darian's voice seemed to come from very far away. What bloodline? What binding? But she couldn't answer. The memories were coming too fast now. 28 years of carefully suppressed heritage crashing down on her at once. She understood now why they had wanted her alive, why they had poisoned but not killed her, exiled but not executed her. They needed her blood, her lineage, to break something that had been holding their true masters at bay. The revenants were advancing now, moving with inhuman speed across the smoking ground. Behind them, more tiers were opening in reality, and through each gap she glimpsed things that made her mind recoil in horror. "Run!" she gasped, stumbling backward as the full weight of her heritage settled on her shoulders like a mantle of lead. "Darien, we have to run. They don't just want to kill us, they want to use me to unmake the barriers between worlds." But when she turned toward their horses, she found only empty air. The animals had fled at the first scent of unnatural magic, taking with them their supplies, their escape route, and any hope of reaching the capital alive. They were trapped, outnumbered, with hostile magic tearing holes in reality around them. And somewhere in the distance, that crimson aurora pulsed faster, as if sensing that its long wait was finally coming to an end. The ordeal had become a nightmare. The revelation struck Alara like a physical blow, memories cascading through her mind with the force of a breaking dam. She staggered backward, her hand pressed to her temple as 28 years of carefully buried truth clawed its way to the surface. "The Voss bloodline," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "We weren't just physicians. We were guardians." The largest revenant tilted its head, a grotesque parody of curiosity. "The little lamb remembers at last. Tell your wolf king what his precious healer truly is." But Alara could barely speak past the torrent of recovered memories. She saw her grandmother's hands weaving light into complex patterns, felt the weight of ancient words spoken over her cradle, understood finally why her medical training had always come so naturally. It hadn't been training at all, but awakening dormant abilities bred into her very bones. "My family didn't just study bloodline magic," she gasped, her voice cracking under the weight of revelation. "We're bloodline magic. For 7 generations, we've been the living seal holding back." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to what she now remembered, lurking in the spaces between worlds. Darien moved closer, his golden eyes scanning their surroundings for escape routes that didn't exist. "Holding back what?" The revenants laughed, a sound like breaking glass and dying screams. "Tell him, daughter of chains. Tell him what sleeps beneath the foundations of every kingdom, what hungers in the deep places of the earth." "The Devourers," Alara whispered, and saying their name made the air itself recoil. Ancient things that existed before the first kingdoms rose, before magic took its current forms. My ancestors bound them centuries ago, used their own bloodline as a living lock. She looked at Darien, seeing her own horror reflected in his eyes. "Every generation, one of us carries the binding. When we die naturally, it passes to our children. But if we're killed in the right way, at the right time, with the right ritual, the lock breaks," Darien finished grimly. The crimson aurora pulsed overhead, and through the tears in reality, Alara glimpsed something vast stirring in the darkness beyond. The conspiracy she'd uncovered wasn't about political power or even conquest. It was about unleashing entities that would devour magic itself, unmaking the very foundations of their world. "That's why they needed me alive," she continued, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "Why they couldn't simply execute me for treason. They had to corrupt me first, turn me into a willing participant. The poison, the exile, the slow destruction of everything I cared about. It was all designed to break my will, make me desperate enough to..." "To what?" Darien's voice was sharp with urgency as more revenants poured through the growing rifts. "To choose death over continued suffering." The truth tasted like ashes in her mouth. "If I died by my own hand, in despair, with my bloodline's magic poisoned and corrupted..." She closed her eyes, seeing the full scope of their enemy's plan. The binding wouldn't just break, it would invert. Instead of holding the devourers back, my death would call them forth. The lead revenant clapped its hands in mockery of applause. "Such a clever little mortal. Yes, your despair was to be the key. But then you had to flee to the Wolf King, had to find hope again." Its burning eyes fixed on Darien. "No matter, your blood will serve just as well. though we'll need to work harder to break your spirit first." Understanding hit Alara like a thunderbolt. The conclave. It was never about deploying biological weapons. She turned to Darien, seeing her revelation reflected in his widening eyes. It's a massive ritual circle. 200 healers from across the realms, all gathered in one place. If they could corrupt even a fraction of them, use their combined power to fuel the binding's destruction. They wouldn't need your willing death, Darien breathed. They could simply overwhelm the bloodline magic through sheer force. But having me there, having the last pure guardian present when they break the seal, Ilara's voice failed as she grasped the final, horrific truth. It would be like opening a door and holding it wide. The Devourers wouldn't just escape. They'd pour through with enough force to shatter every protective ward on the continent. The Revenants were closing in now, their forms becoming more solid as the rifts widened. But Ilara barely noticed them. She was staring at Darien, seeing him truly for the first time, not just as the Alpha King who had offered her sanctuary, but as the man who had unknowingly tied his fate to hers. "You have to leave," she said urgently. "Get back to the Shadowlands, warn the other kingdoms. If they capture us both—" No, his transformation began in earnest now, muscle and bone shifting as his wolf form fought to emerge. "We face this together." But even as he spoke, Ilara could feel something changing in the magic around them. The binding that lived in her blood was responding to the proximity of its ancient enemies, and she realized with growing horror that her very presence here was making the rifts stronger. She wasn't just the key to their enemy's plan, she was the weapon they would use to unmake everything. The binding magic in Ilara's blood screamed as the rifts tore wider, each pulse of ancient power making her stumble. She could feel the Devourers pressing against the barriers between worlds, their hunger a physical weight that threatened to crush her sanity. But in that moment of absolute terror, something else stirred within her. Not the corrupted despair her enemies had cultivated, but a fierce, blazing determination. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the Revenant's laughter. "I won't be your weapon." The lead Revenant paused, its burning eyes narrowing. "You have no choice, daughter of chains. Your very existence feeds our master's return." "My existence," Ilara repeated, her medical mind working furiously even as Darien's wolf form materialized beside her, all silver fur and deadly grace. "That's where you're wrong." She pressed her palms to the smoking ground, feeling the ritual circle veil's blood had traced. But instead of recoiling from the dark magic, she reached deeper, past the corruption to the fundamental structure beneath. The binding in her bloodline wasn't just a lock, it was a living system, one that could be directed. "Ilara, what are you doing?" Darien's mental voice reached her through their growing bond, tinged with desperate concern. "Something my grandmother tried to teach me," she whispered, her hands beginning to glow with silver light. "The binding doesn't just hold them back, it can pull them back." The memories were clearer now, no longer fragments but a complete heritage flooding through her consciousness. 7 generations of guardians had maintained the seal through sacrifice and vigilance, but the first guardian, her ancestor who had faced the Devourers in their initial rampage, had done something more. She had reversed their connection to this realm, turning their own hunger against them. The Revenant leader snarled, lunging toward her with inhuman speed. But Darien was faster, his massive wolf form intercepting the creature in a clash of fang and claw that sent sparks flying. Around them, more Revenants poured through the rifts, but their forms were becoming less stable as Ilara's power grew. She could feel the ancient words rising in her throat, syllables that predated written language. As she spoke them, the ritual circle beneath her hands began to change, its crimson glow shifting to silver. The binding magic recognized its true purpose, and for the first time in generations, a guardian was fighting back, instead of merely holding the line. "Impossible." The Revenant leader threw Darien aside, dark ichor streaming from multiple wounds. "The bloodline is corrupted. The seal weakens." "The bloodline adapts," Ilara said, rising to her feet as power coursed through her veins. She understood now why her healing abilities had always been so strong, why she could see patterns others missed. She wasn't just a physician, She was a living nexus of protective magic, bred to face exactly this moment. And you've just reminded it what it was made to do. The rifts began to close, reality reasserting itself as her strengthened will pushed back against the Devourer's influence. But she could feel the cost. This level of power was never meant to be sustained by one person. Her ancestors had shared the burden across generations, each guardian maintaining only a portion of the whole. Darian's voice reached her again, urgent with understanding. "You're burning yourself out. This will kill you." "Not if I'm not alone," she replied, extending one hand toward him while the other maintained her grip on the ritual circle. "The binding was never meant for a single bloodline. My ancestors just couldn't find anyone else willing to share the burden." Through their bond, she felt his immediate comprehension. The connection they had forged, part political alliance, part growing love, part pure desperate trust, could serve as a bridge. Not to make him a guardian, but to let him share the weight of what guardianship truly meant. "Do it," he said without hesitation, his wolf form shimmering back into human shape as he grasped her outstretched hand. The magic that flowed between them was unlike anything Alara had experienced. Where the binding had always felt like chains around her soul, this felt like wings. Darian's strength combined with her knowledge, his absolute determination reinforcing her wavering will. Together, they didn't just close the rifts, they sealed them, layer upon layer of protective wards flowing outward from their joined hands. The revenants shrieked as they were pulled back through the collapsing tiers in reality, their forms dissolving as the connection to their masters was severed. The crimson aurora overhead flickered and died, leaving only natural starlight in its wake. But even as victory settled around them, Alara felt a new understanding crystallize in her mind. This had been only the beginning, a test perhaps, or merely the first wave of a larger assault. Somewhere beyond the now sealed rifts, ancient intelligences were regrouping, adapting their strategies. "The conclave," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "They'll still try the mass ritual, and now they know I can fight back." Darian's hand tightened around hers. "Then we'd better be ready for them." As they stood among the smoking remnants of the battlefield, Alara felt something she hadn't experienced since her exile: hope. Not just for survival, but for victory. The real battle was just beginning. The silence that followed their victory felt deceptive, like the calm before a greater storm. Alara's legs trembled as the adrenaline faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull her to the ground. The shared magic still thrummed between her and Darian, but she could feel its edges fraying as the immediate danger passed. "We need to move," she said, forcing herself to straighten despite the way the world seemed to tilt around her. "They'll send scouts to investigate when their revenants don't return." Darian released her hand reluctantly, and she immediately felt the loss of his stabilizing presence. The binding magic in her blood had awakened fully now, no longer the dormant heritage she'd carried unknowingly, but a living force that demanded constant attention. Without his strength to anchor her, it felt like trying to hold back an ocean with her bare hands. "The horses bolted north," he said, scanning the scorched ground where Vale's blood had traced its summoning circle. Nothing remained but ash and the lingering scent of otherworldly decay. "We can track them, but it'll cost us hours we don't have." Alara closed her eyes, reaching out with senses she was still learning to trust. The binding magic gave her awareness beyond normal perception, and she could feel the disturbance their battle had created rippling outward through the magical currents that flowed beneath the physical world. Like rings in a pond, but these rings carried information to anyone skilled enough to read them. 2 days, she said, opening her eyes with grim certainty. That's how long we have before they adjust their plans and move forward with the conclave ritual. She looked at him, seeing her own understanding reflected in his golden gaze. They can't wait longer than that. The celestial alignment they need only occurs during the new moon. 2 days to cross 300 miles of hostile territory and infiltrate the most heavily guarded gathering in the known realms. Darian's voice carried no despair, only the flat calculation of a military commander assessing impossible odds. "We'll need help." But even as he spoke, Ilara felt a shift in the magical currents around them. The binding in her blood recognized something approaching, not the corrupted wrongness of the Devourer's servants, but something older and far more complex. She turned toward the northern horizon just as a figure crested the ridge above them. The woman who descended toward their ruined camp moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to navigating treacherous ground. Her hair was silver white despite her apparent youth, and her eyes held the same unsettling depth that Ilara had begun to recognize in others who carried significant magical heritage. But it was the symbol embroidered on her travel cloak that made Ilara's breath catch, a serpent biting its own tail surrounded by 7 stars. The Order of the Eternal Cycle, Ilara breathed. I thought they were extinct. Not extinct, the woman said as she approached, her voice carrying the accent of the far northern kingdoms. Merely patient. She stopped just outside the circle of ash that marked where their battle had occurred, her gaze moving between Ilara and Darien with frank assessment. Though I confess, we did not expect the last guardian to awaken her heritage quite so dramatically. Darien moved protectively closer to Ilara, his posture radiating controlled threat. Who are you? My name is Lirali Starweaver, and I represent interests that have been watching over the Voss bloodline since its founding. The woman's attention fixed on Ilara with uncomfortable intensity. Your grandmother was supposed to train you properly before her death. When she failed to do so, we had hoped the binding would remain dormant until you could be properly prepared. Grandmother died in the plague, Ilara said, but even as the words left her mouth, she felt doubt creeping in. The memories flooding back through her awakened heritage were painting a different picture. Hushed conversations, strange visitors, lessons disguised as children's games that had stopped abruptly when she was 12 years old. Your grandmother died protecting you, Lirali corrected gently. The Conclave's agents had discovered her identity. She chose to sever her connection to the binding rather than risk them using her to reach you. The woman's expression softened slightly. She loved you enough to leave you ignorant and safe, rather than trained and vulnerable. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Everything she had believed about her family, her exile, even her arrival at Darien's court, took on new meaning. She hadn't stumbled into this conspiracy. She had been running from it her entire life, protected by sacrifices she had never known were being made. The Conclave will expect me to come, she said, the pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. They've been hurting me toward this moment since I was a child. Every choice I thought I was making freely was guided by their manipulation, yes. Lirali's voice carried genuine sympathy, but also by our countermoves. The balance has been delicate, but it has held, until now. Darien's hand found Ilara's shoulder, grounding her as the magnitude of the deception threatened to overwhelm her. What do you want from us? Lirali smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. To finish what your grandmother started. The binding was never meant to be a permanent solution. It was meant to buy time until a guardian arose who could end the threat permanently. Her gaze returned to Ilara. You've proven you can reverse the Devourer's influence. Now we teach you to eliminate it. The road back to everything she had lost stretched before them, but it was no longer just a path to survival. It had become a journey towards something that might, finally, set them all free. The training began immediately, with no time for rest or preparation. Lirali led them deeper into the wasteland where their battle had scorched the earth, to a place where the barriers between worlds remained thin enough for controlled experimentation. Here, she explained, Ilara could practice manipulating the binding without risking another full-scale incursion. The Devourers are not just entities, Lirali said, settling cross-legged on the blackened ground. They are hunger given form, the absence of creation made manifest. Your ancestors understood this. They didn't try to destroy something that was essentially destructive force itself. Instead, they created a maze of magical barriers designed to redirect that hunger away from our reality. Ilara knelt beside her, feeling the binding magic pulse in response to their proximity to the thin barriers. But I reversed their influence back there. I pulled them back instead of just holding them. A remarkable instinctive breakthrough, Lirali agreed. But instinct alone won't be enough for what you must do at the Conclave. They'll have warded against simple reversal techniques. You need to understand the fundamental structure of what you're fighting. The lessons that followed pushed Ilara beyond every limit she thought she possessed. Lirale guided her through exercises that required her to perceive magic at its most basic level, not as spells or rituals, but as the underlying force that gave reality its coherence. The binding in her blood wasn't separate from this foundation. It was woven into it, a living thread that helped maintain the fabric of existence itself. Feel how it connects, Lirale instructed, as Ilara's consciousness expanded beyond her physical form. Every healer you've ever trained with, every patient you've saved, every moment of compassion you've shown, they're all part of the same pattern. The devourers seek to unravel that pattern by attacking its strongest points. Through their bond, Darien provided an anchor that kept her from losing herself in the vast web of interconnection. His presence was a constant reminder of her individual identity, even as her awareness touched minds and souls across the continent. She could feel other guardians now, distant cousins whose bloodlines carried fragments of the original binding, most of them unaware of their heritage. "There," Lirale said with satisfaction. "Now you begin to understand the true scope of what was created. Your bloodline wasn't meant to bear this burden alone forever. It was meant to train others, to spread the knowledge until the protection became self-sustaining." But with understanding came a terrible recognition. Ilara could sense the conclave's preparations through the magical currents, feel the way they were systematically identifying and targeting the scattered guardian bloodlines. The mass gathering of healers wasn't just meant to provide power for their ritual, it was designed to eliminate every potential threat in one coordinated strike. "They're not just trying to break the binding," she said, her voice tight with horror. "They're trying to ensure it can never be rebuilt." Yes, Lirale's confirmation carried the weight of centuries, which is why you cannot simply disrupt their ritual. You must replace it with something stronger. The final exercise pushed her to the absolute edge of what was possible. Under Lirale's guidance, she reached through the binding to touch the original moment of its creation, the desperate act of sacrifice that had first turned the devourer's hunger back upon itself. But instead of simply observing, she began to expand that moment, using her awakened power to strengthen connections that had grown weak over generations. She felt the exact instant when the magic shifted from defensive to transformative. The binding was no longer just holding the devourers at bay, it was actively converting their destructive hunger into something that reinforced the barriers between worlds. They would become unwilling guardians of their own prison, their very nature turned against their desire for freedom. Incredible, Lirale breathed as Ilara's power settled into its new configuration. "In one night, you've accomplished what we hoped might be possible given years of preparation." But the triumph was short-lived. Even as Ilara marveled at the strength flowing through her transformed heritage, she felt something else stirring in the magical currents. A response from the conclave that suggested they had sensed her breakthrough. "They know," she said, opening her eyes to find both Darien and Lirale watching her with expressions of mingled awe and concern. "They can feel what I've become." Darien's hand found hers, their bond humming with shared determination. "Then we end this tomorrow." "The conclave begins at sunset," Lirale confirmed grimly. "By dawn the day after, they'll either succeed in breaking the binding permanently or," she looked at Ilara with something approaching reverence, "or you'll have rewritten the fundamental laws that govern the interaction between our world and theirs." As the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, Ilara felt the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment. The ragged exile who had collapsed at Darien's gates was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous and infinitely more necessary. The final test awaited, and failure would mean the end of everything. The ancient amphitheater carved into Mount Threnodi's peak had stood empty for centuries, but now it pulsed with malevolent energy as nearly 1,000 healers filled its stone seats. Ilara crouched behind a wind-carved outcrop, watching the conclave's preparations with growing dread. Each healer wore the same glazed expression of artificial compliance, their wills subjugated by the corruption spreading through the gathering's leadership. "There," Darian whispered beside her, pointing toward the central dais where robed figures arranged crystalline focusing stones in precise geometric patterns. Counselor Malthorn leads the inner circle now. Ilara's former mentor stood at the ritual's heart, his once kindly features twisted by the devourer influence that had claimed him. The man who had taught her to value every life above her own comfort was preparing to sacrifice 1,000 souls to crack reality itself. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. "The binding stones," Lirali murmured from their other side. "They've corrupted them to channel destructive force instead of protective energy. When the ritual reaches its peak, the barriers between worlds will shatter permanently," Ilara finished. Through her awakened heritage, she could feel the wrongness radiating from the perverted ritual circle. Where guardian magic should flow like living water, this felt like acid eating through the foundations of existence. Below them, Malthorn raised his arms, and 1,000 voices began chanting in unison. The words were familiar, a traditional healing invocation, but their meaning had been inverted, twisted to serve ends that would horrify those speaking them if they retained their free will. "We have to move now," Darian said urgently, "before they build too much momentum to stop." But as Ilara prepared to descend toward the amphitheater, she felt a presence that froze her blood. The air above the ritual circle began to shimmer, reality bending as something vast pressed against the barriers from beyond. The devourers weren't waiting for the ritual's completion. They were using the gathered power to force an early breach. "It's too late," she breathed, watching tendrils of pure negation seep through the widening cracks in space. Where they touched the stone seats, ancient rocks simply ceased to exist. "They're already coming through." The first devourer to manifest was unlike the revenants she had faced before. This was hunger given form so pure that looking directly at it made her eyes water. The healers closest to the breach didn't even scream. They simply weren't anymore, erased so completely that reality forgot they had ever existed. Malthorn laughed with triumph that wasn't entirely his own. "Behold the end of your precious binding, child. Come forward and witness the futility of your bloodline's great work." Ilara felt Darian tense beside her, ready to charge down and die fighting, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. This wasn't a battle that could be won with claws and fury. The devourers were manifestations of conceptual destruction. They could only be countered by something equally fundamental. "No," she said, rising from concealment. Her voice carried across the amphitheater with impossible clarity, cutting through the ritual chanting. "You're going to witness the binding's true purpose." She began walking down the stone steps, each footfall ringing with power that made the corrupted crystals crack. The transformed magic flowing through her bloodline responded to her will, but now she didn't try to contain or redirect it. Instead, she let it expand, reaching out to touch every guardian fragment scattered across the continent. "Impossible," Malthorn snarled. "The bloodline is broken. The old protections are dead." "The bloodline adapts," Ilara replied, stepping into the ritual circle itself. The devourer hovering above turned its attention toward her, and she felt its hunger like ice in her veins. "And you've just given it the perfect opportunity to evolve." Around the amphitheater, she could see comprehension dawning in the eyes of healers as her power burned away the influence controlling them. Not all of them. The corruption ran too deep in some, but enough. Hundreds of voices faltered in their chanting as free will reasserted itself. The devourer struck, its essence slamming into her with force that should have unmade her instantly. But instead of trying to resist its hunger, Ilarifed it, not with destruction, but with the infinite creative potential that healing represented. Every life she had saved, every wound she had mended, every moment of hope she had kindled became sustenance for something that had never tasted anything but endings. The entity recoiled in what might have been confusion or agony, its form wavering as it tried to process nourishment that violated its fundamental nature. In that moment of disruption, Ilara reached deeper into the binding magic and spoke a single word that had never been voiced by human lips. The barriers between worlds didn't just repair, they crystallized, becoming something harder than diamond and more flexible than silk. The Devourer's scream as it was pulled back into its prison carried harmonics that shattered every corrupted focus stone in the amphitheater. Malthorn collapsed, the influence controlling him severed as definitively as a cut rope. Around them, reality settled into a new configuration, one that would hold against any force the entities beyond could muster. The final confrontation was over. The war itself had just begun. The silence that followed the Devourer's banishment felt heavy as a held breath. Ilara stood in the center of the shattered ritual circle, feeling the new configuration of reality settling around her like a garment that fit too well. The crystallized barriers between worlds hummed with power that flowed directly through her transformed bloodline, and with growing horror, she began to understand what she had truly accomplished. Ilara! Darian's voice cut through her realization as he bounded down the amphitheater steps, but she held up a hand to stop him before he could reach her. "Don't," she whispered, and her voice carried harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. "Don't come any closer." The magic wasn't just flowing through her anymore. It was becoming her. Where moments before she had wielded the Guardian heritage like a tool, now she felt herself dissolving into it, her individual consciousness expanding to encompass every thread in the vast web of protection she had rewoven. The barriers she had crystallized weren't separate from her, they were her, stretched across dimensions in a pattern that could only be maintained by constant, conscious will. "The cost," Lirali said softly from behind Darian, her ancient eyes bright with unshed tears. "I should have warned you. The original Guardians didn't just create the binding, they became it." Around the amphitheater, the freed healers were stirring, confusion and terror warring in their expressions as they tried to understand what had happened. Malthorn lay unconscious near the remnants of the focusing stones, breathing but changed. The corruption burned out of him so thoroughly that Ilara could feel the hollow spaces where his complicity had been carved away. "There has to be another way," Darian said desperately, his golden eyes reflecting the power that now surrounded her like visible flame. "We'll find someone else to maintain the barriers, distribute the burden." "No." Ilara's voice was already beginning to echo with the voices of every guardian who had come before her. She could feel their presence now, the ancestors who had sustained the binding across centuries through their willing sacrifice of individual existence. "This is what it means to be the last guardian, not the final failure, but the ultimate success." She turned to face him fully, and saw her own reflection in his eyes, still recognizably herself, but wreathed in patterns of light that spoke of forces beyond mortal comprehension. The binding was already changing her, preparing her for an existence that would span millennia as a living seal between worlds. "I'm not dying," she said, trying to offer what comfort she could. "But I can't. I won't be able to return to what I was. The barriers require constant maintenance now, conscious guidance to keep them stable. Someone has to hold the pattern in place." The truth of it settled over them like a shroud. She would become something between mortal and concept, her consciousness spread across the dimensional barriers she had created, present everywhere the binding touched, but never again fully here, never again able to simply be Ilara Voss who loved and was loved in return. "How long?" Darian's voice was barely controlled, his wolf nature straining against the helplessness of watching her slip away from him. "Forever," she admitted. "Or until someone finds a way to make the barriers self-sustaining. The magic exists now. It would take time, perhaps generations, but it's possible in a way it never was before." Hope and agony warred in his expression. Around them, some of the freed healers were approaching cautiously, drawn by instincts they didn't understand toward the power that pulsed from her transformed form. She could feel their potential, the way the guardian magic could be taught and shared if given enough time to develop properly. "Train them," she said to Lirali, even as she felt another piece of her individual self dissolve into the greater pattern. The bloodline was always meant to be a beginning, not an ending. What I've created can be learned, transmitted, grown beyond anything my ancestors imagined. Darian took a step closer despite her earlier warning, and she didn't stop him this time. When his hand touched her face, she felt his warmth through layers of power that should have made such contact impossible, Their bond, forged in trust and strengthened through trials, proved strong enough to bridge the gap between mortal and guardian. "I'll find a way," he promised fiercely. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'll find a way to bring you back." "I know." She leaned into his touch, memorizing the feel of it before duty pulled her consciousness fully into the spaces between worlds. "And I'll be waiting." The transformation completed itself as the sun reached its zenith above Mount Threnody. Alara Voss, the exiled physician who had stumbled into Darien's court in torn rags, became something far greater and infinitely more lonely, the living will that held reality intact. Her sacrifice had saved everything. Whether it had also doomed her remained to be seen. The mountain peak fell silent, except for the wind that carried the scent of changed magic. Where Ilara had stood moments before, a shimmer remained in the air, not quite visible, not quite absent, like heat waves rising from summer stone. Darien's hand still reached toward the space she had occupied, his fingers touching nothing but finding resistance where her presence lingered. "She's still here," he said wonderingly, his voice rough with emotions too complex to name. Through their bond he could feel her, distant now, stretched thin across dimensions, but undeniably either. Different, but here. Lirale approached slowly, her ancient features wet with tears she hadn't shed in centuries. "The binding holds. Can you feel it? The barriers aren't just repaired, they're stronger than they've ever been." She knelt beside Malthorn's unconscious form, checking his pulse with gentle fingers. "The corruption is gone completely, from all of them." Around the amphitheater, the freed healers were beginning to recover their senses. Some wept as memory returned, horrified by what they had been compelled to do. Others sat in stunned silence, trying to process the weight of what they had witnessed. But a few, perhaps a dozen, stood transfixed by the shimmer where Alara's presence lingered, their faces bright with dawning understanding. "They can feel it too," one of them whispered, a young woman whose healer's robes were singed from proximity to the corrupted ritual. "The pattern she created. It's like she's teaching us just by existing." Darien turned toward the speaker, hope flaring in his chest. "You can learn from her, even now?" The healer nodded slowly, her eyes tracking movements in the air that only she could see. "The magic she used, it's not locked away anymore. She's made it accessible, teachable, given time." She trailed off, overwhelmed by possibilities. "Given time, the burden could be shared," Lirale finished, rising from Malthorn's side. "Distributed among enough trained guardians that no one person would need to sacrifice their individual existence to maintain it." The shimmer pulsed, and for a moment Darien could swear he saw Alara's smile within the dancing light. Through their bond came a sensation he recognized, approval mixed with fierce, protective love. She was watching over them all now, holding reality stable while they worked toward a solution that might one day free her. "How long will it take?" he asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "Decades, perhaps centuries," Lirale admitted. "The magic must be taught carefully, tested thoroughly. One mistake could destabilize everything she's created." She gestured toward the healers who were still drawn to Alara's presence. "But these ones have already begun to understand. They could train others, who could train others in turn." Darien closed his eyes, feeling the weight of kingship settle on his shoulders in a new way. His realm would need to become something unprecedented, a sanctuary where this knowledge could be preserved and grown, protected from those who might seek to corrupt it, as the conclave had been corrupted. "Then we begin immediately," he said with quiet determination. "Whatever resources they need, whatever protection, whatever time, it's theirs." From the unconscious conclave members scattered across the amphitheater came stirring movements. Malthorn's eyes fluttered open, confusion and shame warring in their depths as he looked around the ruined ritual site. What have we done?" he whispered, his voice breaking as memory returned. "Dear gods, what did we almost do?" "You were controlled," Darien said firmly, offering the older man a hand up. "The corruption is gone now. You have a chance to help, repair what was damaged." Malthorn struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on Darien's support. His gaze found the shimmer that marked Alara's transformed presence, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. "My student," he breathed. "My brilliant, stubborn student. What has she become?" "Something necessary," Lirali said gently, "and something temporary, if we prove worthy of the gift she's given us." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of growing things, new grass pushing through stone, flowers blooming in impossible cracks, life asserting itself in the wake of narrowly averted destruction. The mountain itself seemed to exhale in relief. The oppressive weight of impending catastrophe finally lifted. "We should return to the city," Darian said eventually, though every instinct rebelled against leaving this place where he could still feel her so clearly. "There's work to be done." The shimmer pulsed again, and this time he felt her presence brush against his mind like a gentle caress. Her voice whispered through their bond, so faint he might have imagined it. "Build something beautiful. I'll be here when you're ready." As the survivors of the conclave began their slow descent from Mount Threnody, Darian looked back once at the amphitheater. The shimmer remained, patient and eternal, a guardian who would hold the line between worlds until love and determination could find a way to bring her home. The immediate crisis was over. The real work was just beginning. The journey down from Mount Threnody passed in contemplative silence, but it was the descent from the mountain itself that marked their true return to the world. As the group wound through forests that had withstood the apocalypse by mere hours, Darian felt the familiar weight of his kingdom's borders drawing near. Yet everything had changed, not just the realm they were returning to, but himself as well. The golden eyes that had once seen through deception now perceived layers of reality he had never imagined existed. Where before he had ruled through strength and instinct, now he carried the knowledge of how fragile the foundations of existence truly were. Each breath felt like a gift. Each step forward a choice to build rather than simply survive. When the obsidian towers of his capital came into view 3 days later, he was surprised by his own reaction. The floating citadel that had once symbolized his absolute power now seemed almost quaint, a child's understanding of strength when he had seen what true power could accomplish. Ilara's sacrifice had shown him that the greatest victories came not from dominion over others, but from the willingness to give everything for something greater than oneself. The city gates opened without ceremony, but word of their approach had spread. Citizens lined the streets, their faces bearing the particular relief of those who had felt catastrophe approaching without understanding its nature. The very air seemed lighter now, free from the oppressive weight that had been building toward the failed ritual. "They know something has changed," Lirali observed, watching the crowds. "Even those without magical sensitivity can feel the difference." Darian nodded, acutely aware of how the people looked at him now. There was the usual deference due to their Alpha King, but something deeper had shifted. They sensed his transformation just as he could feel theirs, a collective understanding that they had all been touched by forces beyond their comprehension and emerged somehow renewed. In the courtyard where he had first found Ilara collapsed in torn rags, Darian paused. The memory felt like something from another lifetime, yet barely 2 months had passed. The woman who had stumbled through his gates had been desperate, fragmented, hunted by her own past. Now she existed everywhere and nowhere, holding reality together through an act of love so profound it had rewritten the rules of existence itself. "Your Majesty?" Captain Thorne approached cautiously, his scarred face creased with concern. "The reports from across the realm, the disturbances have stopped completely. Whatever was building toward crisis, it's gone." "More than gone," Darian replied, his voice carrying new harmonics that made the captain's eyes widen slightly. "Prevented, corrected, transformed into something protective." He turned to face his loyal guard fully. "Send word to every settlement, every outpost, we're going to begin something unprecedented." Over the following weeks, the capital transformed into something the realm had never seen before. A center of learning that drew healers and scholars from across the continent. The shimmer of Ilara's presence had followed them back, manifesting wherever the guardian magic was strongest, and those sensitive to it found themselves pulled inexorably toward understanding. Malthorn had recovered enough to take charge of organizing the new knowledge, his guilt over his corruption channeled into fierce dedication to prevent such manipulation from ever occurring again. The healers who had been freed from the ritual's influence became the first generation of true students, their minds still resonating with the patterns Alara had woven. "She's teaching us even now," one of them explained to Darian during a progress report. "Not directly, but the magic itself has become instructive. Every time we reach toward it, we understand a little more about how the binding was created and how it might be sustained by multiple hands rather than one." The work was painstakingly slow, requiring precision that made diplomatic negotiations seem simple by comparison. But progress came in small victories, a successfully shared burden here, a stabilized fragment there. Each advancement brought them incrementally closer to the day when Alara might be freed from her willing imprisonment between worlds. Darian found his own role transformed as thoroughly as his realm. Where once he had been a king who ruled through strength, he became something new, a protector of knowledge, a guardian of guardians. His court adapted around him, drawing scholars and healers instead of warriors and courtiers. The floating citadel's halls echoed with discussion of magical theory rather than political maneuvering. Yet through it all, he remained connected to her. In quiet moments, when the shimmer grew strong enough to almost seem solid, he could feel Alara's presence like warmth against his soul. She was changed beyond recognition, yet fundamentally herself. Still the determined physician who had exposed corruption regardless of cost. Still the woman who had chosen healing over revenge. Their bond had stretched across dimensions but never broken. Through it came her unwavering support for the work being done, her gentle guidance when the magical instruction grew too complex, her fierce love unchanged by transformation into something larger than mortality. The exile had become the foundation. The broken woman in torn rags had become the cornerstone holding everything together. And the Alpha King, who had once decreed "she stays with me," discovered that some declarations transcend even the boundaries between worlds. Years passed like seasons flowing into seasons, marked not by conquest or ceremony, but by incremental victories measured in stabilized magical patterns and successful knowledge transfers. The capital had evolved into something unprecedented, a floating academy where reality itself served as both classroom and laboratory, where the shimmer of Alara's presence had become as familiar and comforting as sunlight. On this particular morning, Darian stood in what had once been his throne room, now converted into a vast study hall where dozens of healers worked in concentrated clusters. The obsidian throne had been replaced by a simple wooden desk, its surface covered with scrolls detailing the latest breakthrough in binding theory. The transformation felt natural now, as if the room had always been meant for this purpose. "Your Majesty," came a breathless voice from the doorway. Kira, one of Malthorn's most promising students, hurried forward with barely contained excitement. "We've done it. The 7th tier stabilization. It's holding without primary anchor support." Darian looked up from the reports he'd been reviewing, hope flaring in his chest with familiar intensity. After 3 years of painstaking work, they had finally managed to create a sustainable magical structure that could maintain itself without requiring Alara's constant presence. It was only a small fragment of the greater binding, but it proved the theory sound. "How long has it held?" he asked, setting down his pen with careful precision. 18 hours and counting," Kira replied, her young face glowing with triumph. "Master Malthorn says if we can replicate this success across 12 more subsections, we'll have enough distributed stability to attempt partial release protocols." Across the room, the shimmer that marked Alara's presence grew noticeably brighter. Through their bond, Darian felt a surge of proud joy that belonged entirely to her, the satisfaction of a teacher watching her students master a particularly difficult lesson. The sensation filled him with warmth that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with love that had learned to exist in new forms. "Show me," he said, rising from his desk. The walk to the testing chambers took them through corridors lined with tapestries depicting not ancient conquests, but breakthrough moments in Guardian magic. The first successful binding transfer, the discovery of resonance patterns, the development of protective protocols that kept students safe while learning to touch forces that could reshape reality. Each image had been woven by artisans who themselves carried traces of Guardian sensitivity, turning historical record into living art. In the chamber itself, a complex array of crystalline formations hummed with contained energy. At its center, a small section of space held the same quality as the shimmer around Alara's presence, a fold in reality that existed independently of her will, maintained by patterns the students had learned to weave themselves. "It's beautiful," Darian murmured, his enhanced perception allowing him to see the elegant mathematical structures underlying the visible effect. Where once such forces had seemed chaotic and dangerous, now he recognized the sophisticated artistry of their construction. Malthorn emerged from behind the apparatus, his hair now completely silver but his eyes bright with purpose. "She would be proud," he said simply, following Darian's gaze. "Her student teaching students, each generation expanding what we thought possible." As if summoned by their conversation, the shimmer intensified until Ilara's presence felt almost tangible. For a heartbeat, Darian could swear he saw her actual form outlined in the dancing light. Older now, refined by years of existing between dimensions, but unmistakably herself. Her hand seemed to reach toward him across the space between worlds. Soon, her voice whispered through their bond, clearer than it had been in months. "I can feel the pathways forming. Soon I can come home." "How soon?" he asked aloud, no longer caring who heard him speak to empty air. "Years, not decades. The work is accelerating. Each success builds on the last." Around the chamber, the students had gone quiet, all of them feeling the strength of her presence in this moment. Some of the newer ones stared in wonder, finally understanding that their lessons came from an actual person rather than an abstract magical construct. The more experienced students bowed slightly, offering respect to the teacher who existed everywhere and nowhere. "We won't stop," Darian promised, his voice carrying the full weight of royal decree. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes. I know. And I'll keep the watch until you free me to choose love over duty." The shimmer faded to its usual subtle presence, but the promise remained. They were building something unprecedented, not just a solution to an impossible magical problem, but a new understanding of what power could become when wielded with wisdom and restraint. Outside the chamber windows, the city sprawled in purposeful activity, its citizens living lives made possible by a guardian they would never see and a king who had learned that true strength lay in the patience to build rather than the ability to destroy. The broken exile had become their foundation, and her love had taught them all how to reach toward something greater than themselves. The beginning, it turned out, was always the hardest part.